Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Dr. David A. Bishop. He is an author, a researcher, and a consultant in the field of agility, and recently written Metagility, which I have read and enjoyed. David A. Bishop, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so for our listeners who don't know you, before we get into the meat of your book, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I've been in the technology business for about 25 years. To go back to the very beginning, when I was around 13 years old, I started programming computers. I started playing around with a Commodore VIC-20, decided I wanted to be a computer engineer, and went to engineering school, and that's what I became. And I spent 25 years in the technology business, working in telecommunications, utilities, and companies of all different sorts of shapes and sizes. And about 10 or 12 years ago, I decided that I wanted to change course a little bit and become more of a researcher. I began to see a lot of problems in the industry that I felt like I wanted to solve, but I felt like a more enhanced skill set was needed to do that. So went back to school and got my PhD and started focusing more on technology research and how to solve some of these interesting problems that I was seeing in my career.
And when you say interesting problems, what were the top couple of problems that must have motivated you quite significantly as you go back to school at advanced age or a later stage?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. As an engineer, I was continually frustrated by the fact that many of the problems I was being asked to solve were the result of bad management decisions. As an engineer, you're taught that, this is a chance to be creative. You're going to be able to use your creative juices, and you're going to be able to build cool new stuff and cool new products and all this other stuff, which is true. But I felt like as my career progressed, I was spending more and more of my time doing fix or repair or problem resolution and less time on the creative side of things. And that just seemed to be just not quite as fun as I thought it was going to be. And I began to realize that a lot of the problems I was trying to fix were the result of bad management decisions, if not most of them in some way. Either they were bad management decisions or bad project management design, bad requirements design, or just a bad idea altogether. And I started to feel like, I really want to solve these kinds of problems because I think this is where the real opportunity is. And I think that, I sort of developed a passion for trying to solve these problems. And I felt like that's where my calling was, so to speak. And as I got into it, as I began to delve more into doing research, more into doing IT research and business research, and trying to apply that to real case studies, I really enjoyed it. And I was actually making a lot of progress doing that. And I was actually seeing the fruits of my labor more and more, so to speak. And it just became more enjoyable for me. I was more excited about developing a long-standing body of work that would make a bigger impact on the world and the industry that I was in, as opposed to just learning the latest technology that I would work on for maybe a couple of years and then move on to something else and throw that knowledge away and then move on to the next project and the next project. I wanted something a little more long-standing that would have a greater impact.
Right. And so you're actually applying your creativity to management problems as opposed to engineering ones.
That's true. Yes, very much so.
And you said it required a new skill set or a new mindset. Is there something you found you had to shift in terms of from the engineering mindset to this researcher mindset in the field of management?
I think the engineering mindset was very helpful with the research, but I needed a better skill set. Most of the decisions we make in business are based on analysis, maybe some fact finding, maybe best practices that organizations and leaders learn over a period of time. And that's good for most business decisions, but in some cases you need a stronger medicine, and that's when it's time to call a doctor, so to speak, as I say. Especially when you start talking about something like agile transformation, which I noticed early on was having had a very high failure rate. Some people have told me some agile consultants tell me that they think it's as high as 90%. I realized that the standard way of doing business or making business decisions and solving business problems through maybe some short-term analysis and maybe a little bit of business case development and a little bit of Google research and perhaps based on best practices or whatnot, it just wasn't good enough. And so I realized that business research, getting a PhD in business and learning these research skills gave me the tools to provide that higher level or stronger medicine, so to speak, to solve these problems that the typical approaches just weren't able to do.
Right. And I guess we'll get into what some of that medicine looks like in the course of this conversation.
Right.
And so what, and you've just mentioned the high failure rate of agile transformations. I mean, I guess there are lots of areas to look at in the field of engineering and IT. Why did you pick agility or agile? Why did you start there?
Well, because it was probably the biggest problem I noticed when I began to decide to make this change. As I decided to, I would say it was probably the major problem I saw. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Over many years, I had seen some bad decisions or poor implementations of certain projects or certain technology. But when it came to this agile transformation I was working with this particular company, they tried 2 or 3 or 4 times and failed, or they achieved lackluster results. They brought in high pay consultants and still didn't make any progress. And I thought, wow, this is a really big problem here. And then I found out that so many other companies were having the same struggles. I felt like, wow, this is a real opportunity here to try and solve this problem in a different way. Because even though there were so many consultants and agilists out there trying to solve this kind of issue, I didn't see a whole lot of these consultants using business research and to try and solve the problem. And so, it's just like with COVID-19, for example, you don't want to you can go out and swallow some disinfectant if you want to, but it's probably best to go with medical research. So most valid knowledge in the Western world is accomplished through research and a scientific method of analysis and developing these ideas and then applying that to industry. So it's not entirely just academic. Many people have the perception that, oh, well, that's just academic. That's not going to help me in the real business world. Well, it's supposed to. I mean, even medical research and other types of research are academic. That's how they start. But because there's a methodology and there's a standard that you have to go by to make sure that what you've determined is valid. But it can be applied to industry in many ways.
Yeah. And that was interesting reading your book, actually, is that almost every paragraph there's a reference to a scientific paper. It's a extraordinarily well-researched book.
And that's important because that's an attempt to validate what I'm saying. I'm not trying to, because otherwise it's nothing but an opinion. And everybody's got an opinion. You know what they say about opinions. So, and opinions can be fine. But in an industry, and especially in a situation like agile transformation, in an industry like technology or IT, which is highly contextual, you've got to have you got to be able to back up what you say. And it surprises me that so many people don't do that. When you look on LinkedIn and you look at some of the Agile forums where people discuss some of these topics, they'll come up with suppositions or statements that they just pull out of the air based on their own experience or their own beliefs without really backing it up with any kind of research. And so there's so much churn and uncertainty in it. You've got to stay grounded somehow. And that's what I do with the work that I present. It should give the reader a lot of assurance that, hey, this is valid, this has been researched, it's been peer reviewed, and you can believe it, believe what I'm saying.
Right.
Because I wouldn't believe what I'm saying if I didn't have that kind of validation.
Yeah. And I certainly resonate with we described on a prequel, how Agile's a Red Sea, right? It's lots of consultants and lots of firms competing for the Agile dollar, all with an opinion and a perspective. And I'm sure I've been guilty of the same, over the years. So it's potentially quite a differentiating contribution to have such a well-researched book in the mix here.
Right.
Yeah.
There's been a good bit of body of research on Agile, but solving this specific kind of problem has not been there. How agile are you? How do you know how agile you are? How do I if I want to develop embedded systems, how do I do that in an agile way? What is the best way? How do companies leverage agility to become number one in their market, which is the real purpose of agility? These questions have not really been directly answered by the research or in the practitioner community. And so that's the contribution that what I've done makes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sure most of the people listening to this will be familiar with agility, but I do know that there may be listeners or people who've got this far in the conversation and who are still, may understand agile, the English word means, but don't really understand it in the way that it's used within the IT community. And in the first part of your book, you talk about what agile is in terms of its original conception, how it's being applied today, and the issues with it. So maybe we could start with what agile, big A, is, and then work out from there.
Agile is the ability to respond to change. It's the ability to adopt innovative technologies very quickly and produce products that still have a high level of quality and a high level of value to the client. That's essentially what Agile is. And it's a derivation of lean manufacturing and of course, flexibility concepts that come out of, a lot of the Toyota production system that was developed in 1979. There was a paper published on that. And prior to that, you had Deming and his 14 points and his total quality management. These are lean manufacturing concepts that agility, or Agile as we know today, is derived from. Agile was essentially an application of this lean manufacturing ideas to the software industry as a result of the manifesto published in 2001.
Right. And the early part of your book, you take that manifesto, which is very famous now for a large part of the IT community, and you've looked at how the context has shifted since that was written. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think most people are familiar with the 4 tenets of the Agile Manifesto, which is broken down into 12 principles. But the manifesto was written in 2001, and of course it seems like yesterday to me, but it's actually been a pretty long time ago now, almost 20 years. And a lot has changed. Even in the technology industry, a lot has changed. If you look back at 2001 and how the technology industry was at that time, tools were different. The way we developed software and technology was quite different. Back in the day, at that time, most of the interesting products were developed based on internet technology, e-commerce. The internet is where it was at. It was all about software. Whereas today, the internet is always going to be important and software is always going to be important, but most of the cool innovation, if I can call it that, is happening with devices. So it's not just about software anymore, it's more about devices. And devices are composed of what we call embedded systems, which means they have hardware, firmware, and software components developed on different tracks, often by different teams, sometimes by different companies, but has to be released as one cohesive product. So that's hard to do in an agile way. So that's just one example of how Agile has, well, not Agile, but how the technology business has changed. The products have become more complex. The tools that we use to support ourselves have changed. And innovation is moving at a much more rapid pace. So, for example, if I were to go through the 4 tenets, we don't have time to go through the 12 principles, but if I was to focus on the 4 tenets of the Agile Manifesto, for example, one of the tenets was individuals and interactions over processes and tools, meaning that, okay, we're more focused on people. We want a people-focused process, and we really don't want to call it a process, and we don't want to focus so much on tools. That was the original idea. But globalization has led to more complex teams and interactions. Agile was originally designed for co-located teams, small co-located teams working together. But that's not really the context that we work in today. We typically work with people all over the world all the time. And so you have to have tools to be able to do that properly, like the tool we're using right now to have this conversation. And today's tools have matured. They've gotten much better. They actually facilitate these interactions and they drive these processes. When you look at one of the most important ideas behind Agile is collaboration. Well, there's a whole suite of collaboration tools that we have today, like Slack and other tools that just like that, which didn't exist 20 years ago. And I don't think people even realize that those would even be needed. Or, we had email and we had some messaging and stuff like that, but you didn't have Slack. You didn't have these collaboration tools that were designed to facilitate this interaction between large distributed teams. And so that's how that has changed. It's really, instead of individuals and interactions over processes and tools, it's more individuals and interactions plus processes and tools. And so that's how the application of that tenet has changed over the past 19 years. And then if you were to look at the next one and say, well, we used to say working software over comprehensive documentation, meaning that we really want to focus on developing working software and getting that out the door, because back in the day, developers would have to create this long form documentation along with the code that they created, which was time consuming and took away from getting product out the door. And this was considered to be very laborious, and developers hated doing it. And I remember having to develop some of that documentation myself. But that has changed. Today, it's more about working product with documentation. Product meaning, hey, it's not just about software anymore. It's more about devices, like I said earlier. But also documentation is and always is going to be very important for any technology product. You've got to have something to tell you how to use the darn thing, right? But it's taken a different form. Instead of sitting down and writing these long form documents, you have artifacts such as epics and user stories and decision outcomes documented with your collaboration tools that becomes your documentation. So you still have documentation, it's just taken a different form. And then if we were to look at the third tenet of the manifesto, where it says customer collaboration over contract negotiation, meaning that, okay, we want to be totally customer focused, and we don't want to try and force a customer to adhere to this very strict contract, right? That was the waterfall method of, okay, this is exactly what we're going to deliver in 12 or 18 months, and we're never going to change from that unless you pay a lot of money, and then that's going to change everything else. But today, customer collaboration includes contracts and negotiation, because collaboration, which is a tenet of Agile, and negotiation are essentially one and the same, as it's been applied in our case studies. And collaboration happens faster through a variety of stakeholders, both internal and external, meaning that your customer is really a partner, and they're not just someone you collaborate with. In many cases, the customer to client relationship or the vendor to client relationship is somewhat blurred. They become a partner in helping you develop this new innovative product. And so, like the fourth tenet of the manifesto, if we were to talk about that, this is the big one, right? Responding to change over following a plan, meaning that we're not going to use these plan-based methods like waterfall anymore. We want to be able to respond to change. That's the whole point of being Agile. But in reality today, that has morphed into more about responding to change while following a vision, because you may not have to have a strict, specific 18-month roadmap or plan, but you still have to have a vision for where you want to go. And yes, you're going to respond to change, but you want to make sure that that change you're responding to adheres to your vision. You have a vision for where you want to go, and you have all these changes coming up, but you want to accept the changes that are going to take your company and your organization where you want to go, and maybe ignore the changes that aren't going to help you achieve your vision. Some of the case studies that we worked with made strategic decisions about which customers they were going to listen to. Some customers, were very strict in some of our case studies and said, well, we want you to deliver this by this and have this, this level of quality and such. And our best case studies would say, we're not going to work with you. And they would ignore those clients, and they would stick with clients that were going to collaborate with them very closely to achieve this innovative product and take them where they wanted to go according to their vision. And that's very important because many companies, especially young companies, are focused on, whatever customer we can get. That's the customer we want to work with. We want to get as many customers as possible. But if you have the wrong customer and you're trying to achieve a high level of agility, that can actually cause you to be less agile.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so.
Okay. And for those who are listening to that and thinking, well, yes, but hang on, those who wrote the Agile Manifesto weren't saying not and, right? They were saying, responding to change over following to plan, but they still had this concept of and, right? And we will still have plans, and so are you potentially creating a straw man there of what those in the manifesto had originally intended?
Well, the plan, so to speak, again, a plan typically implies a very specific set of features, typically over a longer period of time. It's what we call a roadmap, and that could be 12 to 18 months out. And in most Agile organizations, it's hard to really develop a solid plan or roadmap more than 6 months out. So you may still have a plan, you may still have a roadmap, but it's not going to be 2 years. It's going to be more about 6 months. But the vision is much more important than just the plan. The plan is your short-term plan of what you're going to achieve over the next 6 months, maybe what you're going to achieve in the next release. And you've done your sprint planning and you have your iterations and you figured out, okay, these are all the features that I think we're going to be able to get done in the next 8, 9, 10, 15 sprints that we hopefully will plan to release in 3 months once we get these sprints completed. And this is what our release is going to look like. So you may have a plan from that perspective. And of course, sprint planning itself, the word planning is in there, right? That's part of the process. So you're still following a plan. But it's what the change is here is that instead of having this long-term roadmap with all of this specific detail, or not having one at all, the idea is that you have to have a vision. Because one danger of Agile is that organizations can become too myopic. They focus on the next iteration, and they lose sight of the fact of, well, where are we going? What are we trying to accomplish here? And so you have to have that vision to make sure that, okay, we're slowly but surely getting to where we want to go. And it's a vision for our products and our company that we're trying to achieve. Because you can make a 12-month or 18-month plan if you want to, but it's probably going to change quite a bit.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. So I'm just trying to sort of get in my mind summarize the argument here. But is it something like whilst a lot of, in essence, what the manifesto was saying is still valid, there were some sort of important omissions in terms of emphasis, like the fact that you need to have a vision, like the fact that processes and tools to some extent drive the interactions, right? So it's not as simplistic as putting that, assuming those to be entirely dominant, when the reality is that our processes and our tools do drive a lot of the communication.
Yeah, if you look at that statement once more, it said responding to change over following a plan. Well, it doesn't tell me, well, am I supposed to be able to respond to all change? What the revision here that I'm saying is, yeah, you're responding to change, but it's governed by a vision. You don't respond to all change in the market. If you do, that could cause you to become less agile. You have to have this vision that you're trying to adhere to. And our highest performing case studies did that. They had this vision. They made strategic decisions about what kind of change they were going to respond to, not everything. And that's very important. And that's something that was kind of left out. And many people believe that you're supposed to be able to respond to all change and every change in that market. Well, no, our best case studies made some very strategic decisions in what kind of change they were going to respond to, who they were going to listen to. And they developed a vision that was going to take them where they wanted to go. And they evaluated every change opportunity against that vision.
Right.
And that's the difference.
Okay. And is there anything else that you think they missed out?
I don't think so. I mean, beyond what I've already said, they're essentially refinements. The idea that instead of customer collaboration over contract negotiation, it's customer collaboration includes contract negotiation, because over time, contract negotiation and collaboration have become one and the same. It's very much one process that includes a variety of stakeholders throughout the company, as opposed to, in the old days, just your lawyers and executives getting together with the client and writing out this contract, and then everyone else just, proceeds from there. The actual development of the product idea and the refinement of it happens at many levels within the company, not just with the executives who are signing on the dotted line.
Right. So it's actually part of collaboration.
Right.
Yeah. No, I see. Then you go on to talk about some of the issues you started to touch on there with agile teams. This risk that they can become myopic. What are some of the things that you discovered that can be the issue with agile teams?
Well, agile has the good things. I'll start with the good things first, which most of us are aware of, but I want to make sure that the audience is aware of that. Agile has been proven in the research and in the practitioner community to improve quality and reduce cycle time, improve job satisfaction, productivity, customer satisfaction, all those things. But there's always been a lot of negative stereotypes with relation to Agile. Many of them are not really true. For example, that many people will say, well, Agile is an undisciplined process. No, anyone who's tried to conduct an Agile transformation knows it takes a heck of a lot of discipline to make it happen. It takes a heck of a lot of discipline to get your developers in a room for 15 minutes every day and have that stand up. So it's a very disciplined process. But what are some of the problems with Agile? Well, Agile has had challenges with large, complex products and large, complex development environments. Those are some of the biggest issues. There's also been issues with large distributed teams because it was originally developed with co-located teams. So managing large distributed teams in our new global environment that we work in has been a challenge for Agile. And many companies have issues with technical debt, meaning that they don't change the way they develop requirements. And I can talk about that too, but that's been a problem that I often see with many Agile transformations is loads and loads of technical debt that accumulate over time. And of course, we talked about.
And for those who are less technical, that's where over time the sort of basic design and structures of your technology become less and less well adapted to the problem you're trying to solve.
That's right. And a lot of times it's the result of bad requirements management because you have oftentimes what happens is during an Agile transformation, roles and responsibilities change. And a business analyst in a waterfall environment, their job may change to what's called a product owner in the Agile world, but they don't change the way they develop requirements. And so, if you think about developing requirements in a waterfall environment, what a business analyst typically does in that situation is they try to dream up all the things that they believe that the client is going to want. And one of the things I hear from BAs often is, oh, I'm just afraid I'm going to miss something. Well, in an Agile environment, you're not supposed to be afraid that you're going to miss something because you can always add it into the next iteration. But what happens because of that waterfall mindset they have, they brainstorm about new requirements that they think the customer is going to want because they're afraid that they're going to miss something. They're afraid something's going to be left out because in the waterfall world, that would be a big problem if the customer didn't get something they expected and if it wasn't captured in the scope. But the problem with that approach in Agile is you're not supposed to. What happens is they, in many of our case studies, they would create more and more requirements. Well, let's add this and let's add that instead of working directly with the customer and using a top-down approach to develop the requirements based on what they knew the customer needed. And so this results in too many requirements based mostly on what the BA thinks is needed. And that makes it difficult to prioritize the requirements. It makes it very difficult to decompose them, makes it very difficult to figure out, okay, what's the most important thing I need to get done in this next sprint? And those requirements keep getting added to the backlog. And your backlog gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's your technical debt. And out of control technical debt is one of the biggest reasons I've seen for Agile transformation failures.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And so it's a lack of ability to apply the disciplines that are required of this Agile process.
Yeah, there's not a when agile transformation happens, and I say consultants because oftentimes this is something most companies don't do alone. They usually bring in some consulting help to make it happen. Many consultants focus strictly on the development and testing teams, and they focus on, well, let's make sure everyone's doing all the Scrum rituals and let's set up our sprints and our velocity and capacity metrics and the mechanics of the Scrum process, which is very important. But they don't spend a lot of time working with the requirements. And that's many of the problems with agile transformation happen upstream of the development teams and the testing teams. And that's where your requirements are being developed and the actual product genesis is being created. And there's just many consultants don't have the engineering expertise to try and figure out what these BAs are doing wrong, or they don't see what the BAs are doing wrong. And that's very important because everything flows downstream, as we know. And if you don't fix that, you can make all the changes you want with the development and testing processes, but they're not going to make a lot of headway unless you change what's being delivered to you upstream.
Right.
And that's typically requirements.
Yeah. And so just from my understanding here, so but as I see it, what you've just described is potentially an excess inventory of requirements on the shelf. And I can see how that's a problem for the process in general. But how does that directly contribute to technical debt? Because my understanding was technical debt is more about the design of the technology as opposed to how many requirements I have in my backlog.
Well, it can be both. Your technical debt includes requirements, and these requirements can be business requirements. They can be more technical requirements. Okay. You may have technical requirements that come from the development teams that say, hey, we need to move to this new architecture. We need to move to this new platform. Or whatnot. And yeah, those are requirements as well. Those go into the same backlog and have to be prioritized in the same way. And so yes, that is what you say. But in addition to that, you have the business changes or the business requirements coming in from the BAs as well. And so yes, it's true that when we focus on one iteration after another, and we're focusing on getting that working software out there, many development teams don't have the time to go back and, I need to fix this, I need to fix that, I need to make this architectural change, or we really need to go back and fix this at later date. And those become requirements in the backlog, and that is technical debt. And many times they're so busy that they don't have time to go back and fix those things, or by the time they do, it builds and builds. But again, that's also the result of what the BA is doing, because many times the BA is linked to the business, and that sets the tone for what's going to get done first. It makes it more difficult to prioritize because they all have to be done by the same teams typically, whether it's an architectural change that the developers have suggested, or whether it's a business requirement, the same teams is doing the changes. And so if the BA is creating tons of business requirements based on what they believe is needed as opposed to what the customer really needs, and they're not decomposing it in the right way to make it easily digestible, then it's going to become very difficult to prioritize. And you're going to have these architectural changes, and you're going to have these business requirements. And oftentimes, you may have a product owner or a product manager that says, well, this has really got to get done now. Well, the development team says, well, I think this really needs to get done too. And that back and forth gets really hard to resolve, and it becomes very difficult to prioritize. And that can result in a lot of churn. And oftentimes, depending on the situation, one side or the other may win fairly consistently, which may mean that either business requirements get ignored or the technical requirements get ignored for a longer period of time, neither of which is good.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. Okay. So there's this problem of this tendency for technical debt to build up. What are the other big issues with Agile as you see it?
Well, I mentioned earlier about difficulty with large, complex products and large development environments. Large development environments meaning typically, as I mentioned earlier, globalized teams, large teams distributed all over the world in different time zones. But probably the biggest problem I saw was with large, complex products. And the most complex products today are embedded systems. As I mentioned earlier, it's more about if you look at all the innovative technology being created today, it's really more about devices as opposed to just a software application or a website. Your smart meters, your smart grid, your smart cars, your smart devices, your cell phone, everything is a smart device. And these smart devices have a lot of moving parts. You have hardware, firmware, and software developed by different teams, sometimes even by different companies, that at some point have to be tested and released as one cohesive product. And that's very hard to do in an agile way. And that's the nut that my first case study was trying to crack 10 years ago that I was working with. They were in the smart metering industry, and they were trying to solve this problem. And it was very difficult to do because many consultants were coming in and saying, well, everybody needs to be purely agile. Everybody needs to be doing stand-ups every day. Everybody needs to be on 2-week sprints. And our teams developing hardware were thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Why would I? That's stupid. It just doesn't fit with, we don't understand why we need to do this. And some of the firmware teams had some of the same ideas, but the consultants weren't familiar with this kind of context. They weren't familiar with dealing with this kind of situation, and they didn't know what to do. They really didn't know what to tell these people. And so, we had software teams that were becoming more agile, but the rest of the organization wasn't following along. And how do you manage that? And how do you bring these other teams forward? And how do you make the whole organization agile? Was a big challenge, and it didn't go very well for quite a while.
Right. Yeah. And as you say, that is extremely common now because kind of as software eats everything. So that's true on one level, right? But it's also true that devices and hardware is getting smarter and smarter and needs that software. So you do these twin forces, right?
Sure, and it's becoming more integrated into our lives and in our society. If you look at, 20 years ago, I worked for a major airline at the time during 2001, during 9/11, actually. But I worked as an architect for the website, and it's just a website. People can call the 800 number if they have a problem, and we're more focused on operations right now and our planes and all that stuff. The website was just sort of a sideline. But today, technology, back in the day, it was mostly if there was a technology failure, it was an inconvenience, or there might be some money lost, but it wasn't, people wouldn't get killed, okay? But today, that's not true. When you think about the Boeing 737 MAX and the software problem that happened with that plane and the tragedy that happened after that, and then you look at how with Equifax and Capital One and some of our big financial institutions and how technological failures are impacting them. This puts our financial systems and our economy at risk. And so the stakes are much higher today than they were 20 years ago with relation to technology. And so a higher level of quality and a higher level of agility is more critical today than ever because technology is so integrated into our lives. I mean, with these phone devices and then our televisions in our cars becoming self-aware. I mean, it's much different than it was 20 years ago. The stakes are so much higher, and Agile is one of the primary ways of maintaining that level of quality and innovation that's so critical to, back in the day, it would have been more critical to saving money. It does the same thing today, but today I think it could save lives and help preserve our financial security.
All right. Okay. So you make the point very powerfully that we need ways to manage this, I guess, converged development of both devices and software simultaneously. Much more complex than the scenarios where Agile was originally developed, as you say, co-located team, developing purely software on a fairly stable hardware base, right?
Right.
And they were generally working, it was just one team, one company. And now we've got potentially multiple teams, if not multiple companies, all on slightly different platforms, all trying to coalesce to produce one product at a time or one cohesive product.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as my research efforts began in that case study, we started making some incremental changes and doing what we call action research to try and make certain changes and observe the results of those changes. to make a long story short, our case studies managed to, many case studies that I worked with didn't do too well, but there were a few case studies who managed to acquire what I call a super agile adaptation that enabled them to become number one in their market. And so Metagility captures the essence of what that agile adaptation is and what those case studies were doing right that other companies were doing wrong. And that's very, very exciting because, that's what Agile is really all about. It's when people talk about Agile today, they talk about, it's a methodology to help your teams work better together. And, everyone's going to be happy with flowers in their hair. And it's more of and that's important. I mean, yes, it can do those things. It can make your teams work better together and it improves quality and does all those things. But the main gist of agility is competition, becoming number one in your market. Remember, Agile is a derivation of lean manufacturing techniques. You think about the Toyota production system and that paper that was published by those two Japanese researchers in 1979. That's what took Toyota from making tin can cars to becoming probably one of the premier automakers in the world. And so that's what Agile is really all about. What were some of the characteristics of the successful Agile adaptation that I'm talking about? Well, probably one of the biggest characteristics was a hybrid Agile implementation. And that's very important because when people think about hybrid agility, it has a lot of negative connotations. They think about, that's Agile or Scrum or Fall, or, that's kind of a failed state where someone tried to adopt Agile and it didn't work out and they ended up basically adopting a hybrid of both Waterfall and Agile.
Yeah, it's a compromise, right? You're settling.
Yeah, that's right. You're settling. It's a compromise. And it has a lot of bad connotations, especially with Agile purists. But the truth is that our best case studies took a hybrid Agile approach, but it had to be purposeful. It was based on a specific design. It wasn't just something that occurred by accident. It was based on a specific design that was proven by the results. It helped these companies become number one in their market. And so the key to hybrid agility, first of all, hybrid agility is not bad. Many say that it's probably the preeminent implementation style used by most successful companies. So it's
there was this staggering statistic in the book, right? Only 5% of companies report a strict adherence to pure Agile.
That's right, yeah.
Only 5%.
Yeah, and most of those companies are probably just developing software products, maybe websites, maybe just desktop software or what have you. But they're probably not developing embedded systems. Yeah, very much so. And so this hybrid Agile process, it has certain character. In the book, I talk about all the different characteristics of a good hybrid Agile implementation. First of all, I talk about how do you figure out if you should adopt a hybrid Agile implementation, because like you said, there are 5% out there that don't. Some companies should take a pure Agile approach. Some should just stick with Waterfall. Some should go with a hybrid Agile implementation. But in the book, I talk about how to make that decision. And then I talk about how to, if you take a hybrid Agile angle, what is the right mix of Waterfall and Agile attributes? And I outline those in specific detail.
Yeah, and to give us broad brush, right? So it's a hybrid approach. This is this sort of super adaptation, right? Super Agile adaptation is to encourage us to take this hybrid approach. What are some of the commonalities, if you could point to them, that you found?
Sure. Well, when you talk about an embedded systems organization, the context we're discussing here, you have these typically three basic tracks. You have software, firmware, and hardware. And the way it works is the different teams adopt Agile in different ways. So you may have your software team that is more of a pure Agile adaptation. They've got 2-week sprints. They have daily stand-ups. They're doing the retrospectives. They're doing the pure Agile implementation. And this is very important because many companies who develop embedded systems, they use their software teams as the early strike force to solve problems because they know the other teams can't move quite as fast. It's also more cost effective. For example, the Boeing 737 problem I mentioned earlier, their solution was a software solution, right? So they're going to try and find software solutions before they look into hardware or firmware solutions because can be developed quicker at much lower cost. So software teams are typically more of a pure Agile adaptation, and they're used as an early strike force for the organization. Then you have the firmware teams. The firmware teams are developing software that is closely tied to the hardware. At the same time, the software teams use typically both software and hardware to test against at some point and develop against. And so the firmware teams function as even though they're developing code, they don't move as fast as the top level software teams. In other words, they typically will have 30-day sprints. They won't have stand-ups every single day, maybe once a week. And so that's a different adaptation to how they're doing things. And then you have the hardware teams who they may have more of a waterfall type of approach. They may still have, an 18-month or 12-month development cycle. But they acquire certain capabilities that allows them to keep up with the other teams. So our research shows that they will try. One of the methods that worked very well was to develop rapid prototype development, that they could throw a prototype together to give to the firmware and software teams that they could use to develop and test against, because there's so many interdependencies between these teams, and managing that is very challenging. And also, they developed a process for creating cheap, I guess I would say, low budget projects. So, for example, if we did have a client who needed a hardware solution, and they needed it right away, and it couldn't be solved with a software solution or a firmware solution, we would create a low cost hardware project, maybe less than $50,000, that would allow the hardware team to develop a quick fix in a matter of weeks to solve that problem, instead of waiting for the next 12 or 18 month development cycle. So that's how these three tracks of development, if you will, adapted Agile differently. And that allowed this organization to move very quickly with their embedded system solution. And of course, there's a lot of interdependencies and interplay between these three tracks, and how do you manage that? And in the book, I talk about interconnections and interactions, which we hear a lot about Agile. That's another thing. When we went through the 4 tenets, we saw the word people and interactions over processes and tools, right? Well, interactions, what does that mean? How do I know what interactions I'm supposed to have? Am I supposed to just chat with you every day? Is it really just about the stand-ups? But in the book, I go through detail to classify these interactions into different groups, and to define exactly what these interactions are and how to manage them. And that's very important too. So those are some of the examples of what this hybrid Agile process looked like.
Yeah.
So some of the attributes.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting you talked about the stage gating, which of course I remember as a software developer and doing Agile. That was this sort of, we lived in fear of the stage rate, right? All the documentation you'd have to get ready for this stage gate, and it just felt overly burdensome, and like it was from some sort of dinosaur age. And
right.
And yeah, I think you make a really compelling case for, in this type of situation where you've got teams working at different speeds, actually bringing them all together around some sort of formal gate to be in sync makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the stage gating was very helpful. It's not, and back in the day with the waterfall approach, stage gating was this big wall, right? Oh, you've got to have everything together by this stage gate, or you're not going to pass, and the world's going to end if we don't pass that stage gate. But in a hybrid Agile implementation, the stage gating is more of a synchronization point. It's a way to keep these development tracks in sync. It's a way to check with the hardware teams, the firmware teams, and the software teams, and to monitor them to say, okay, are we still on track? Are we missing anything? Are there any interdependencies that are going to cause one team to fall behind? So it serves as a checkpoint, sort of a check and balance against the iterative Agile development process, to make sure that we're going to deliver on time, and we're going to be able to deliver this complex embedded systems product on time, not just the software. Because, business is business. Business isn't going to change. There's always going to be, your customer almost is always going to want a date. They're going to want, okay, well, when am I going to get this? Is it going to be May 4th? I need that, they may say, well, I like this agile process. I'm all for agility and this and that, but they're still going to want dates, and they're going to want to see something at some point. So that stage gating process just helps ensure that you're going to meet a deadline, because business is about deadlines. I don't think the deadlines are going to go away to some extent. And so it helps keep helps keep you honest. Helps keep your development teams honest.
Although to be fair, that is shifting a little bit, right? I mean, if you take Apple, for example, they sort of moved away from saying, we'll deliver you the next iPhone on this date. They may indicate a quarter or a year, but isn't there some movement away from deadlines?
Sure.
Even in the embedded context, right?
Yeah, I think it's all about working with your clients. And like I mentioned earlier, your clients are your partners. Your clients collaborate. You collaborate with them, and they're more like partners as opposed to clients. And so typically you can, through this collaboration process, negotiate with them. Okay, we're going to show you something around this time frame, or if timelines need to change or shift, it's typically not as big of a problem as it may be, because you don't have that, this contract drop dead date or whatever, where we got to have it by then. So yeah, there's certainly flexibility, and it's all about working with your customers to develop that collaborative mindset and approach to being able to have that flexibility.
Yeah. But it sounds to me like there's a big finding here is that it's okay to have different cadences. Like, not everybody has to be on a weekly sprint, and not everybody has to follow the sort of
That's right.
Let's say the Scrum doctrine. Right? We flex across teams, and we don't make people wrong for not following what might be applicable in one area to another.
Sure, absolutely. And as long as it's grounded in research, do you have research and the case studies to back up these different approaches or techniques? And that's very, very important, because many companies are trying to do the same thing, but they're doing it by feel or by intuition or by motivated by what maybe the development teams or project managers want to do. They may say, well, we want to adopt this attribute, but we don't want to do this, or we don't want to do daily standard. We don't, if you go that route, you're headed towards failure, or the best case scenario is you're not going to achieve the results you really want. The point is that it's flexible. You can make changes. Agile is not written in stone. It's more like that movie Pirates of the Caribbean, when they talk about the pirate code. It's more like a set of guidelines, instead of rules, right? But you have the flexibility has to be grounded in research and grounded in case studies so that you know that what you're doing is going to work, at least with some level of assurance.
Right. Okay. So we talked before we came on the call about this other central idea in the book of the Agile Vortex or Agile Vorticity.
Sure.
So should we dive in and have a go at applying fluid dynamics to this context? Yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the biggest problems with Agile, one of the biggest challenges in the Agile community, is answering the question of how agile are you? How do we measure agility? That's a big question when you think about it. We're undertaking all these Agile transformation efforts, and in the end, once we're done, well, how do we know we've really achieved what we expect? And if we need to improve, how do we know what needs to be improved and how to get there? And how much agility needs to be achieved to become optimally agile? And so answering that question has been a big issue in this industry for a long time. And so in my research, in addition to doing a qualitative research against case studies, an interpretive case study to interpretive qualitative research against these case studies to figure out this hybrid agile implementation and this super agile adaptation, I also realized that there was a central phenomenon going on here that I wanted to try and dive into, which was the gravity that was pulling everything else. And so I applied what they call in academic world grounded theory analysis. It's a method of qualitative analysis to help you figure out, to look at a case study and figure out, well, what is the central phenomenon going on here? And what's driving everything? And what is this really telling us, right? And so I applied grounded theory analysis and came up with the idea of Agile Vorticity. That's what came out of that analysis. And Agile Vorticity essentially answers the question for how agile you are. It provides a measurement for it and the methodology to determine it. And that's very important and somewhat groundbreaking, I like to think. And so I'm always excited to talk about it and explain what it is, and because I think it's very important. It's very important to maintaining your competitiveness in the industry. It's very important to being able to measure, these agile transformation efforts and determine how successful or unsuccessful they were. And so that's critical, I think, to be able to establish that kind of metric.
Okay. So let's break this down. So a vortex is like a whirlpool. Yeah?
Right.
So what's happened? So in your metaphor then, what's pulling, what are the forces at play that's causing this whirlpool? Should we start there?
Sure. It's basically innovation and hyper accelerated markets that's causing this whirlpool. And I call it a whirlpool because it's essentially a thought experiment. When Einstein described relativity, he used the elevator, right? So thought experiments are a very good way of describing and illustrating theories. So I use the whirlpool in this case. And what's driving this whirlpool is hyper accelerated markets. The rate of change that we're experiencing today in the markets and technology markets is so much faster than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Everything is moving at an ever accelerated pace. And it's more, instead of just being a fast moving river, it's more like a whirlpool or a tornado type effect, if you will. And so at the center of that is market pressure. That's the thing that's pulling technology companies into trying to develop these innovative products. Is this market pressure, this desire for this new technology or these new products, and that's the center of your whirlpool. And on the outer rings of the whirlpool, where things move just a little bit slower, you have your product management teams within your organization who are trying to figure out, okay, what type of product does the market want? And what is the market timing for this product? And what's it going to look like? That's called product genesis. And in the book, I go into detail about what product genesis is. But it starts with your product management teams who are trying to figure out and develop the vision for this new product that they think the market wants. It's being, pulled by this internal pressure, this centralized, this gravity, if you will, inside the whirlpool. And then on the outer rings is the outer rings of the whirlpool are your development teams, your development and testing teams, your software teams, your firmware teams, and your hardware teams. And again, I'm using the embedded systems context because I think it's so relevant today. And they move at ever successive slower rates, right? The hardware teams are on the outer ring of the whirlpool because they move the slowest, and then firmware and then software. And so that's called your organizational agility or your process agility, the agility of your organization. And the product genesis and your product management team and the market pressure on the inner side of the whirlpool is your market agility. And so the idea is that your market agility is moving at one speed and your process agility is moving at another speed, right? And typically the market is moving a little faster. What does that mean with relation to vorticity? Well, vorticity is a fluid dynamics concept. So if you picture a river, a flow of water, for example, the water in the center of the river is moving faster than water closer to the bank because it's slowed down by friction. And so if you take a vorticity meter, which is like a little buoy with a flag on it, and stick it in between those two flows of water, it's going to spin very fast because the inner flow of water is moving much faster than the water closer to the bank. That's high vorticity. If the flows of water are moving at the same speed, that buoy is not going to move at all. You're going to have zero vorticity. And so when you look at the whirlpool, you have your process agility, which is the agility of your organization, your hardware, firmware, and software teams on the outer rings of that whirlpool. And then you have your market agility, which is the market pressure and the feature set that your product management organization has put together as the genesis of the product moving at a faster speed. You stick that buoy in between those two flows of water, you're going to have high vorticity because the market agility is moving much faster than the process agility. And so what that means is, okay, you need to become more agile from a process agility perspective to keep up with the market agility. You have high vorticity. The flows of water are moving at very different speeds, and that little vorticity buoy is moving very, very fast. If you can obtain enough agility from a process agility perspective and get your development teams moving at the same rate as your market agility, the flows of water are moving at close to the same pace, and you're going to have zero vorticity between the two. And so that's how Agile Vorticity is defined.
I see. So you want to reduce as much as possible how fast that buoy's spinning, right?
That's right.
The differential in flow at the different rings.
Right. Yeah. Your market agility, which is determined by product genesis and the market pressure, oftentimes is moving at a much faster rate, and so you want to try and achieve the same rate with your process agility, which is your development and testing teams.
Mm.
And inside the book, I basically break down the process and market agility into its smallest components. And I go into detail about that. There's a framework diagram in there, which breaks them down into different pieces, and also a few more illustrations, which helps understand how this zero vorticity is achieved. There's different ways and techniques of doing that, but
right. But isn't it to some extent a choice as to how close you want to be to the speed of the market, right?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Because if you want to be, an innovator in your market and on the cutting edge, and then you want to chase that and be as move as fast as the market as you can. But
right.
You strategically decide to be, let's say, a later adopter, rather than being first, right? You may.
Sure.
You may want make a conscious choice to go slightly slower than the fastest in your market.
Right. And you may want to see where the market goes for a while before you decide to jump in, right? That's a very valid point. And the idea of vorticity allows you to sort of help figure that out. Well, okay, I want to make sure that I'm not really concerned about being the most agile, but I want to make sure I don't fall too far behind. So I want to make sure I have a happy medium there where maybe I'm just behind the curve so that I can, see where these other players are going and let them experience more of the growing pains, so to speak. And but I don't want to fall too far behind. So Agile Vorticity can help you sort of figure out that happy medium as well.
Yeah. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Simon Wardley, are you?
I don't think so.
No, he's a UK complexity thinker, you might say, but he's got this idea of a Wardley map, which maps where you're playing across the sort of ecosystem from a pioneer at one end to, I think it's a pioneer, settler, town planner, city planner, but to somebody at the other end of the infrastructure, at the other end of the ecosystem, should I say, who's much more interested in scaled commodity provision as opposed to cutting edge pioneer. And I think in that context, it'd be interesting to overlay this idea of vorticity versus his map. I think as I hear you speak.
Yeah, absolutely. That does sound very interesting. Yeah. There would be an overlay, I would think. Yeah.
Okay, I could see that. That makes sense. And also, and if you bring the vortex metaphor back into play, could you also not say that it would be appropriate maybe that some parts of your organization would spin quicker? So some level of sort of vorticity across the layers of your organization may also be okay.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, oftentimes your software teams are going to move faster than the hardware teams. Maybe not always, but oftentimes that's the case. And yes, that's very true. Yes.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be like you'd always want it to be like a river where the flow is consistent all the way across. You might be okay that it looks a bit more like a whirlpool and faster in some places, like, as you say, in the product genesis, and slower at the, let's say, hardware development. Yeah. No,
Right.
interesting.
Absolutely.
No, that's such a rich metaphor, though, and seems so much more sort of sophisticated than are you regularly engaging in these 20 practices and yes, no, and outspits a maturity metric. Yeah, this
Sure.
seems like a richer way of looking at it.
Absolutely. I like to think so. And I'm pretty excited about it because I think there's so much value that it adds in many ways because it's not just an academic theory, even though it's derived from scientific research, which most agile methodologies are not. But it's broken down into all of its subcomponents, which are easily applicable to industry, easily applicable to practitioners.
And you're coming at it, and what I like about it is you're coming at it from the question of, am I out competing the market, or am I at least as fast as the market around me, right?
Right.
That's the Gary Hamel quote, isn't it? Change as fast as change itself, or So
Right.
yeah, am I changing fast enough, as opposed to am I effectively adopting XYZ practices?
Right.
Something like that, right?
Absolutely. That's the measure of agility. And again, that's another problem that people get stuck on is they're focused on, well, I'm defining my level of agility as, how well am I adopting these practices? And it's fine to look at that, but that's not really what you should be looking at. You should be focusing on results. How agile is it making you in the marketplace? That's what you really want to look at. And that's where, the real value add is. And so people often become too myopic and focus on the mechanics of agility as opposed to what it's really supposed to do for them.
Yeah. And you talk about agile as product engine. I like that phrase.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, so is there anything more? I mean, I know you conclude in the end of the book about, where you see agile going, any sort of closing remarks on the future of agility as a movement?
Yeah, I think that data science is going to continue to drive more advanced tooling to help us make decisions, especially with artificial intelligence. I think that's going to be an impact on, how we prioritize requirements and how we manage our projects. I think that's very important. I think Agile is becoming integral to strategic planning. Agile isn't just a development process; it's a whole new way of doing business. And more company leadership are realizing that Agile needs to be included as part of their strategic planning, and not just, oh, well, that's just a development process those coders and testers worry about. We don't need to worry about that. But no, they actually do. It changes the whole way you do business. It needs to be included in your strategic planning because of what I talked about at the beginning about the vision. You've got to establish what that vision is and make sure the change you're acquiring adheres to that vision. It's going to take you where you want to go. Also, I think that agile organizations require agile leaders. So it's not just your development people and testers that need to be agile. Your executive team and your managers need to become more agile as well. And new markets need to be continually sought out. I've seen in some of my case studies where they became number one in one market, but they never changed. They never looked for new markets. And when that market dried up, they were started to lose agility. They started to, lose money, and because they were failing to seek out new markets. Okay, we might have achieved what we want to in this one market, but what about these other markets that we're related to? What other things can we do? You have to constantly seek out new markets and can't just focus on the same market forever. That's one mistake I've seen, even with some case studies who achieved really great initial success. And I also believe that Agile is going to continue to evolve, as I talked about at the beginning, how the 4 Tenets of the Manifesto sort of, evolved as how they're applied versus, what the actual text says that was written 20 years ago. I think it's going to continue to change. And I think we're going to see that. I believe that this hybrid agile implementation is going to become more common and perhaps become the typical as opposed to the atypical agile implementation method. I think you're going to see that more and more.
Yeah. or at least accepted as the typical. I mean, to some extent, it is the typical, right? It's the de facto. Right. We say that now, 5% of purist implementation. So this is what I'm taking. One of the things I'm taking out of this conversation is, let's embrace it, accept it. This is the de facto,
right?
And now let's ask ourselves, well, how do we optimize that? Why is it the de facto, right? Which I think you've answered to some extent in this book, right?
Sure.
Well, it's because people are really successful with it.
Yes.
Not in every context, but in potentially the majority of contexts.
Right.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Good. I feel like I hope we've done the book justice, and I hope that's whetted people's appetite to dive in. I'll bring the book up on screen here for those who are watching. Yeah. Metagility, Managing Agile Development for Competitive Advantage. We'll put a link to the book in the description of the show. Anywhere else you would point people?
Well, they can take a look at Metagility.technology, which is where we're posting our course offerings. I do teach courses regularly all over the world, but right now I'm doing in the US, but I've taught courses in Europe as well and other places. So you can check there for our latest schedule. And of course, right now, face-to-face courses have been pushed back. I think we were going to supposed to have started already, but they've been pushed back to August because of obviously the pandemic situation. But I'm hoping to keep the courses scheduled for the fall. So you can take a look at that. Also, AgileWorks, our website, agile-worx.com. That's our company website. There's a lot of information out there you can take a look at and find out more about us. And of course, please check out the book too. The book is available everywhere books are sold, available electronically as well as textbook. So
yeah. Good. All right. Thanks once again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.